So I would encourage people to be creators, not consumers of this stuff.
Yeah. Wow.
So I took your optimism and then totally took you out of the knees.
Hello and welcome to Undocked. That was a bit more professional, wasn't it? We didn't
a little bit. I like that. Welcome to Undocked. I'm Nick Chubb.
I'm Raoul Harris. And we are now undocked and drifting out to the sea of our sort of subconscious rambling. So welcome.
With no script and no idea.
Yeah. Unplanned, unscripted.
We have a real follower. So there's now 3 followers on Spotify. One's definitely me. I'm pretty sure one's you. And there's one's an actual real person.
I checked this morning. It's actually 4. So it's a very fluid... It's a very fluid situation.
Hey, we're making moves.
And let's start by some self-indulgent reflection on some of the feedback, which has been quite funny, I think, from week 1. I think the best description I heard was a maritime goggle box. That was good. I did have a message I did have kind of that said it's Rory and Alistair, which I think people will get from the UK will probably get that reference, which is the sort of
big question is who's who.
The rest is politics. Yes, that's it. Well, yeah, there's an aggressive one, an intelligent one. So I'll let the public decide.
We'll work that out over time.
No, but it's been interesting. You know, I think people do sort of appreciate the informality of it and the kind of drifting of it, which is good, which is the point. And with that, you know, what have you got, Nick? What's come up in your week?
I saw a really interesting post by a guy called Daniel Priestley, who, if you're remotely interested in entrepreneurship, he's well worth a follow. I think I've read all of his books and follow him on social media, and he's a very, very smart guy. But he put out a post that said, in a post AI world, there will be 2 fundamental traits that will be required sort of across the workplace. So, you know, everyone's talked in the past about things like IQ being very important to how you get on in an office environment. Then over the last 10 years, everyone's talked about EQ being the thing that everyone needs to think about. Yeah. His view on it is that with AI being able to pick up a lot of stuff, the 2 fundamental traits that are required is, number 1 is agency. So just the ability to get things done. And so, you know, is a person what you'd consider high agency? And I think that there's a great meme about high agency people where, you know, there's a little cartoon that someone gets stranded on a desert island, and the low agency person picks up a load of sticks and puts them out on the sand to say help in big letters, and then just waits for someone to pick them up. And the high agency person picks up all the same sticks and then turns them into a raft and sails off the island themselves. And I think when you've got to a point where AI can enable you to do near enough anything, you've got all of the world's knowledge at your fingertips in a chat interface suddenly, and the ability to process information at a pace that was previously completely impossible. What does that enable you to do? And then the second trait becomes discernment, and that is knowing what to do and what not to do. So now, just because you can do anything, actually having the good judgment to be able to establish what you should be doing and where you should be spending your time and what you definitely shouldn't be doing becomes a really important trait. And I thought that was really interesting because it kind of cuts across all of the workforce. It doesn't matter if you're kind of leading a company or leading a department, or if you're working on a team. Those 2 traits, I think, will become very, very important. And there's a great maritime example that I saw in Maritime CIO, which is a little newsletter that we run. It was an interview with a guy called Raymond Gutierrez, who built himself an AI chartering agent. And he said that it's now saving him somewhere between 5 to 7 hours a week. And he's got no engineering background. He's from a chartering background. He's from a shipping background. He just self-taught on YouTube and pulling together different AI agents. And he's now got to a point where he's near enough saving a day a week. And he's spending that time, instead of doing kind of manual tasks and sending emails and moving data around, he says he now spends his time focusing much more on his clients, focusing on the real kind of detail of the charter parties that otherwise he might miss, socializing with counterparties. And he says just having the time to kind of sit and think about what's next has been transformative for him. I thought it was just so interesting that someone's just taken that and run with it on their own.
Yeah, I'm struggling. As you were saying that, I was struggling to think of the examples that I've seen of that. But there are these entrepreneurial people, and shipping is actually full of them, particularly from this sort of engineering side, who are really good at kind of grabbing, you know, available materials and available kind of, you know, resources and kind of bolting together things. And actually, my memory of the early days of sort of software kind of coming into more mainstream into shipping was actually that, and a lot of that stuff kind of ran out of road really when things started to go online, because then you needed to have much more robust, so what I mean by that is that, if you're making a little application that needs to run as an executable and it's kind of totally isolated, you can kind of do what you want really, and as long as it works, it doesn't really matter. Once you sort of start to kind of have to look at taking things online and into the cloud, there are then a million kind of considerations that you need to work through, and that's where a lot of people's kind of DIY started to fall apart. What's fascinating about what you're saying there is that that's a good example of well, you mentioned the word agency, the ability for people to kind of just have an idea and then translate that idea without having the software chops, without understanding sort of how to. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know how he kind of put that together. But that's a really interesting kind of concept, really. And it's one of the things that I think is a point of friction with me and AI. And that is that sort of like, on the one hand, it's this huge kind of enabler of creativity. And on the other hand, it's really something that kind of undermines the creative professional, I think. And there's a really interesting dichotomy there. And it's actually the topic that I was going to raise. But let's not go there for now. Let's stick with the thread that you're on there, because I think that's really, really fascinating. And did he explain to you kind of what he's got this? How does he regard this sort of, is it like an AI assistant, or is it really just using AI to kind of create a piece of software? How does he talk about it?
I think it is a series of small agents that are taking a single task that ordinarily had to be done manually. And that might be checking a position list. It might be updating a position list, sending an email. And there's almost like a little army of them that are doing this, that are all tied into each other. And I think the most interesting thing about it for me as well is that he did this entirely off his own back, personally, on his own personal laptop to start with, without speaking to anyone at the company. And it kind of raises so many questions and issues about how to do this stuff well, and also at an organizational level, how to enable this stuff. But
governance, I mean, fundamental governance, like no one's making and deploying software in an organization, typically without there being a kind of a governance process. And normally there's somebody running the whole kind of IT side of it, or the information system side of it, that's kind of signing that off. And this is one of the issues I see for businesses more generally, where you've got these kind of entrepreneurial people who are grabbing these tools and using them without perhaps realizing, for example, that if you're putting data into ChatGPT and you haven't got your settings correct, you're violating data policy fundamentally. So there is this kind of need, I think, to us to kind of very quickly start some parameters and some consistency in how we kind of govern stuff. It's very different if he's running his own business and deciding tools and stuff to generate, versus being part of a corporation which has all sorts of responsibilities and kind of running. And that's sort of something that maybe doesn't get talked enough about, really. It's a little bit like, I'm reminded as well around sort of one of the things that sort of early when people started to kind of use WhatsApp in business settings, to sort of almost override the fact that email was kind of laborious and everything was kind of, collected in there. One of the things that they were doing, once you suddenly go into WhatsApp, that it's encrypted, you can't get hold of it. This is why it's causing scandals when governments are kind of starting to do stuff over WhatsApp chat groups. And again, it's like a really good example of how technology disrupts in ways that perhaps you don't expect it to.
That whole question around governance and how to get that right is really interesting, because there was an article, I think it was back in beginning of the year, January, February, about Hill Dickinson, the law firm, and they just took an outright ban to all generative AI tools, because they'd seen on the kind of analytics on the IT side, they'd seen this massive increase in usage by staff. And so they just said, we'll ban it unless someone can come to us with a reason why we need to use it. We need to use it properly. And that feels like almost too far the other way as well, that you're going to kind of potentially ban these tools and then write yourself into extinction. And so I think is a really, really fine line for organizations to tread in getting enough flexibility that people can use these tools with the right governance in place, that you don't end up accidentally violating a data policy or sharing data with a large language model publicly, but also enabling enough innovation that people can use these tools so that you don't get left behind. And I think, taking the kind of headline quote from that interview with Ramon, he said that, if companies aren't using AI, they will die in the next decade. And I think that comes across quite hyperbolous, but actually it's probably it's probably not an unreasonable judgment to take, given what he's been able to do just on his own.
You were just
Right.
saying there about, all of that stuff that goes in and training of the models. And this is that Disney and Universal have raised an action against Midjourney, which is a kind of image generation and animation or video, I guess, if you put it that way. And this is really interesting because there's all sorts of stuff going on at the moment about artists sort of wanting to get their fair share of the fact that AI is. You could describe some of the real benefits of what AI is able to do for you is largely copyright avoidance in some ways, because they're kind of taking all of that and removing any connection there might be to the original works. But it's fundamentally, if it's trained on those works, then it's obviously there has to be some connection back to it. And this interesting thing about, so there are already kind of court cases, there are already things. Hollywood is obviously very, very interested in this, and there's been lots of actors and stuff looking at how they're being sort of taken into consideration with this. But the thing about this one that's different is that there's really the size of the pockets of Disney and Universal going into this, and obviously that makes it a lot more likely that there will be an outcome, potentially a favorable outcome for them. And what this does is it really would then force AI companies to only train on licensed content, which is a completely different kind of model. And I think there are some different AI engines that are working already on that sort of basis. So of course they suddenly have a much bigger kind of much bigger sort of role to play, or an easier path towards what they're trying to do. But I think that what it really comes down to is that sort of that thing around recognizing the IP of the thing that you're training the AI on. And this could be a real game changer if this court case goes in the direction that Disney and Universal are looking for it to go into. And it's interesting as well, just to kind of as an aside, in the same week, I think it was this week or possibly last week, the UK government has come up with some problems on this as well. And they've been sort of trying to pass a law saying AI companies can use AI IP material unless somebody opts out, and a lot of people have pointed out that's just sort of simply impossible for creators to sort of decide to opt out of all the things that might be going on. And interestingly, the Lords, which is the second chamber of the UK government, has blocked that pretty unequivocally. I think I wrote it down here, 221 to 116, but to insist on an amendment which will force them to be transparent in what they're using to train their models. And I think about that as somebody who's always kind of worked in the creative side of things. I think it's really, really important that people are recognized for that contribution, and that people are also able to discern and understand or know what's being created by AI and what's being created by a human being. I don't know why I think that's kind of important, but I think it's kind of, I would like to know that I'm electing to make that choice. And then the last thing also out of there, which I read this morning, was a rather hilarious thing from Deezer, where they were saying that like 70% of streams of AI created music are actually fake. And our agents
AI listening to AI.
Exactly. Which is kind of fool the algorithms and to sort of make sure they get paid, which of course it comes out of a pot which is distributed to artists. So it's again taking money out of the creative. But the idea that I was reminded, I saw somebody I know on LinkedIn, and I think they'd been offered a bot, that said, I've scraped your LinkedIn feed and I can write posts for you. I can create all of those posts, recreate you effectively as an agent on LinkedIn. And I think I made a joke on the thing at the moment. It says, as long as we don't make real humans have to read that's fine. And the idea that that would be like the absolute kind of, for me, that would be the end point of LinkedIn, the kind of, what do you call it? The event horizon of LinkedIn, where you've got like fake people writing stuff for fake people to read, it's just like almost kind of like there's some poetry in that, like.
I do feel, as someone who spends a long time on LinkedIn, I do feel like it has turned into like just this absolute pit of AI-driven despair. Like half the comments you see on big posts now are 100% written by AI, and not even like well. And I reckon now it's got to be like something like 25% of the posts themselves are going that way as well. Like you could just tell with like the placement of emojis and like how it's framed. It's always like just perfectly framed, like it's so clearly not been written by a human. But on that point around IP, I'm not 100% sure I agree with your take, because if you took that, I think what should happen is IP infringement should be thought of around the output, right? I mean, I've seen when I was growing up lots and lots and lots of episodes of The Simpsons or Family Guy, and I can't draw, but let's assume I could. If I then started to draw those characters and create my own panels of those characters and then publish them, that would definitely be IP infringement. But the fact that I've seen them and can reference them from popular culture doesn't necessarily mean that I did anything wrong in consuming that content. So where do you draw the line? Because you can't just stop these models from consuming content that exists in the world or consuming information that exists in the world just because I don't know. I feel like we can't end up in a world where you can only have stuff that is consumed by humans. That seems like an almost slightly antiquated view. But where I 100% agree with you is that if something is produced that is materially the same as what has been produced elsewhere by AI or humans, that would be some kind of IP infringement.
Yeah, it's a complex one. I think what you're saying there is sort of like, the first example you gave is all of us all the time are absorbing ideas and inspired by other people and what they're doing, and that's obviously going to shape what we do. I think perhaps the difference here is that sort of, that ability to say, quite like, I like that illustration style that illustrator creates. Create me something like that I don't have to pay for. I think that's kind of a different thing, really, because you're saying, I like what that person is doing, I just don't want to pay for it. And that's where I think a lot of people in the creative industries are getting hit at the moment. I like that music, but I don't want to pay for it. So create me something that kind of like is a simulacrum of that and what the machine is able to do that you and I as human beings aren't quite able to do is analyze that on a very binary level and then just work out how to reconstruct it in a copyright avoidance kind of style with that in mind or whatever. I think that's kind of like, I understand where you're coming from, but I do think there's a flagrant abuse going on in some areas.
It's really interesting. As an example, there's business books that I've read that I've found incredibly helpful, like, finance books and things like that. And I found the principles so helpful that I've actually, I have bought the book, but I've then taken the kind of the Kindle file and uploaded it to a custom GPT, and then I then take our P&L and upload that into that custom GPT and ask for kind of coaching based on the principles of the book. And I'm now sat there questioning, well, am I creating? Is this some kind of IP infringement? That I've created a kind of custom bot based on a book. And I'm now questioning myself. I actually don't know.
Well, I was just going to applaud you for that. How enterprising that sounds. I mean, that sounds very smart. But I don't know. I don't know because that's sort of principles, isn't it? Which the person who's written the book is sharing with you, and you paid for the book, and you learnt those principles, applied them. I don't think that's really what I'm talking about, to be honest. And
I think probably if I turn around and then sold that. If I sold access to that, I could definitely see that that feels like it is IP infringement.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. It's quite a rabbit hole, I think, to go down. But the interesting thing is, and this is where I sort of like, I'm going to just come back to your original point where you said about agency, and the second point was discernment around what to do. And this is one of the things where I try and give people, friends of mine that work in creative industries, some comfort, is to say that, one thing that you see, and LinkedIn is a very good example. I put a post on LinkedIn saying, is AI is the new clip art, discuss, some months back, because all I could see all over LinkedIn was all these really unimaginative, like, create me an illustration that's kind of, and it was just this, it all looked the same. It was just wallpaper.
Yeah.
It was just guff, So discernment, this is really one of the things that well, we shall see how far AI goes, but taste is an important thing for a creator to be able to look at and understand where something has some personality and something unique about it, and so I think that discernment thing that you're talking about, I think when you talked about it, you were talking about it in terms of the discerning sort of what to do and what to prioritize and what to do. But I think you can also be discerning about the output. So when I use AI tools, for example, I'm typically using them to avoid the blank paper syndrome. I've got a big blank sheet of paper. you almost don't want to touch it because it's so white and it's so pure, and like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
don't know where to go. Whereas you kind of throw stuff in and you get going because and you see, oh well, I don't like that, well, that's clumsy or that sounds cheesy, and then you start kind of working on it, and it's almost like kind of like that discernment, that ability to be able to look at that and say that's not good enough, or that's not in the
yeah,
right direction, or that looks too much like that. This is where I think it goes towards the other side of the argument that I was saying up top, which is like AI is a force potentially for creativity, in the same way that some of the music tools that have transformed people who can't really play any instruments very well to be able to build something orchestral through
yeah,
the
yeah,
use of software. And I think it's kind of similar in that space as well, provided there's the originality there. The problem is, of course, whether those creators can, that working with AI will be so far ahead and their output will be so much more superior and stand out from the sort of the less qualified or the less discerning creator to earn a living and be able to demand a premium for that art. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because normally why people hire good photographers, why do people hire the best graphic designers, the best, music people? It's to be able to diversify, to pull away from the rest of the pack and to show something aspirational. So if we end up with this miasma of kind of like everything looking the same because it's all created through the same algorithms and prompts, then perhaps artists of AI will be able to really be able to differentiate. That's my kind of hope anyway. We should always have a little bit of hope in this chat, and that's my hope in this chat.
That's why I'm fairly relaxed, as obviously, running a research business, like we are the prime target to be disrupted by this stuff. And so we are trying to work through how we get ahead of it and how we use the tools correctly. But it is really difficult. It's a bit of a minefield that I'm currently trying to get our internal and external AI policy pulled together so that we can enable people in the right way, but it's really difficult. But I'm also quite relaxed in that I think we're going to end up in a situation where there is significantly more content, and that content is going to become significantly more samey, and therefore good original content that's been derived from, we do 250 interviews a year now with end users and decision makers, derived from those insights that you can't get through the internet. I think that sort of content will stand out. So that's my kind of optimistic view on where we will end up. But just one final point on this. I think that because we've talked about supercharging creativity, the other thing to think about, and a trap I think a lot of people may end up in, is also supercharging consumption. I think if you're not proactively trying to create with these tools, I think it's so easy to now fall down the trap of just, there's just so much content that can be created so cheaply and so customized to you and your avatar that you can literally just waste hours and hours and hours consuming this stuff. And I think that's going to get worse and worse and worse as the models get better at producing tailored or even one-off content. So I would encourage people to be creators, not consumers of this stuff.
Yeah. Wow.
So I took your optimism and then totally took you out of the knees.
Well, you're just making me think about, like, because I periodically delete Instagram and then put it back on when I want to show off that I'm in some fabulous location or whatever. And I can't resist the urge to turn it back on. But like when I do put it, I'm always reminded why I should immediately delete it. And it's those feeds that are kind of, and as you were talking then, I was just thinking about the number of those that are AI generated now. And the kind of weird things that are coming through, like you say something and then it is almost kind of like to the point now where I'm wondering whether there are, things being set up based on picking up the algorithms of what people are, interested in from a content perspective, and then kind of letting AI loose on that to kind of go, well, what's the kind of apex of that, But I think one of the things that I did want to talk about, and I think it sort of fits in with what you're saying here with the AI and the agency and stuff, was I wanted to get into the Splash publication, the Ship Concept 2030 publication that they did.
Yeah.
It reminded me about the article that you wrote for them, which was the sort of like on deck. It was a drama, really. You wrote a sort of drama. One man's created. You're going to tell me you used ChatGPT to write it now, but, but anyway, rather than me sort of talking about it, I thought it was great. And I've got to ask you some questions about it, but sort of maybe it's easier if you explain where people can find it, because I tried to find it this morning, I couldn't find it.
Yeah. Well, I was asked by Sam at Splash, and occasionally he gets in touch and says, "Would you paint a picture of what life might be like on a ship in 2030 or 2035?" I think this one was 2035, and I kind of sat and thought for a while and thought about where we are today and how much work gets done in a chat interface of some description today. And probably thought, around the world, it's probably something like, 5% these days of kind of knowledge work is happening in some kind of chat interface. So kind of taking that 10 years ahead to its extreme, it seems logical that there would be some kind of chat interface available for a ship's master coming onto the bridge in the morning to be able to understand kind of where the ship's at. So it's kind of set out as a chat between a kind of ship GPT and the ship's captain. Doing a kind of morning briefing about what's happened overnight while the captain's been asleep. Where are they on the voyage? Where are they going? What are the kind of issues that they're potentially facing? And it was really fun to write because you can kind of let your imagination run wild with you in terms of, what's the ship going to be carrying? What's the ship going to be fueled by? Who's actually kind of fully in control of the ship? Is it the ship's captain, or is it this agent plus the shoreside team? And I really enjoyed it. I think it's available on Splash 24/7, but I missed the deadline for it to go into the actual ship
So it was
concept.
that's why I was like thinking this should be in that magazine, really, and because it was perfect.
It was supposed to be, but I was too slow. I missed the deadline for print.
Well, yeah, physical media has this constraint, I guess. But the but just for the listener, this is really good, and we'll put the link in alongside the pod for you to have a look at it. It's really good. What's really nice about it is it's not written about like, oh, there's, well, let's imagine the ship of the future and stuff. It's just literally kind of like, it's very kind of, what's that Arthur C. Clarke movie where he's chatting to Hal? It's probably called
Space Odyssey.
I don't know. 2001, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hilariously, that's what they thought in the 80s would be happening, or the 70s. They were sort of wildly missed them up. But 2001 Space Odyssey, they're on a craft and there's this sort of supercomputer called HAL, and it kind of reminded me that, what was the supercomputer called, or the AI assistant called? Do you remember?
I'm gonna have to look it up. I can't remember what
it was something. Yeah, it was something like. Yeah, it was a sort of.
Was it just
Greek
ship
name.
GPT? Oh no, it was. That's
no,
it.
It had a name.
It was like Proteus.
Proteus, that was it. Proteus. Yeah. I knew it was something kind of like, Greek sounding or whatever. But the thing that's really nice about it is it kind of really kind of brings it to life, and you kind of can imagine you've got this master on the ship and is talking to it. And I think what it does is it sort of speaks to the number of things that will be autonomous or semi-autonomous. And, it speaks a little bit to what I was saying when you interviewed me about AI. And I was like, the thing that's sort of really interesting is that idea that it sort of starts to just, rather than give you information, tell you what you need to know fundamentally. Like it does right, I know what the master's thinking about. I know what his jobs to be done are. I'm going to kind of then present him with the information that he should be aware of. I'm going to ask him what he wants to do about certain things, whether he wants to, offer those options up. And it was just such a great illustration of sort of where that's the logical endpoint of a lot of this stuff. Because I think when we talk about automation, we often sort of get off into the idea of just the autonomous ships, but this was a kind of much. So the big question I wanted to ask you, in light of everything we've been discussing, was sort of how much of it was a flight of fancy, with you kind of thinking like, I dare to dream, and how much of it was like, I can see these emerging trends, I can see these nascent sort of technologies developing, and I'm going to imagine that works and it deploys at scale, and so yeah. What do you think?
So there was a few things. Well, I guess one, just as the overall concept of there being some kind of chat interface for those on board the ship. I think that's happening. There are a couple of companies working on that already. Mainly they're focused on taking things like technical documentation and surfacing the right information for troubleshooting the ECDIS or something like that. But if you take that to its kind of logical endpoint, you can see that becoming more and more operational. the article talks about there being an unmanned bridge time, and I think that's something we've had unmanned machinery spaces at sea for 20 years or so, where there's enough automation in the engine room that it doesn't have to be manned all the time. Not on every ship, but on quite a lot of ships. And I think where you've got these kind of automated watchkeeping systems going, is that I think the next logical step of that would be to get some kind of approval where you can move to an unmanned bridge. When you're in open ocean, good visibility, I see no reason why one of these automated digital watchkeeping systems couldn't do the kind of basic job of looking out the window and then alerting someone if something goes wrong. The article kind of takes that one step further, where actually that there is a sort of automated collision avoidance happening as well, within the bounds of the kind of master's standing orders about what the master needs to be woken up for. And so the ship just took some evasive action without even notifying the captain, and then told the captain the next morning. That's probably taking it a little bit further than reality. Yeah, is probably a bit of a stretch. And then a couple of other kind of, I guess, more kind of fun things was, the ships carrying green methanol or going to load green methanol. And I kind of thought, well, where are we going to have green methanol production? And actually Iceland, got this sort of abundance of green energy, geothermal energy. If you're going to create a green methanol production hub, Iceland's probably quite a good place to do it. And then you've got the fact that it's winter, and actually we're approaching Iceland from the north, sort of effectively saying that the kind of north channel routes are opening up, and those Arctic routes are starting to open up because of climate change. I think that's sort of becoming more and more likely. And then the other thing was around the kind of potential just in time penalty for the ship. So the port is backed up, the terminal's backed up, but the charter party agreement says they have to be there at a particular time, and they want to slow the ship down to save fuel and to reduce emissions and improve the CII rating. But if they do that, they'll potentially be in breach of the charter party. And so instead of actually just slowing down, what happens is this GPT ends up raising a whole bunch of kind of note of protest type paperwork to go out to the terminal, to go out to the charterer, rather than actually just kind of solving the problem, which I think, sadly, that's the kind of pessimistic view, is that we'll still be doing that in 10 years' time.
I think that was the kind of like the little kind of artist touch leitmotif, or like, the little kind of thing which I thought was really kind of elevated it, because first of all, I mean, the first thing to say is, listening as you talk about it, I'm not surprised at all. It's sort of all the best science fiction is based in science fact, right? So there were some really nice touches in there, and that one was the most, that was quite a contentious kind of thing in there. Now, interestingly, I'm going to bring this back to the ship concept report, and as I say, I do want to talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about it next week a little bit more. But one of the really startling things, they got a report and reports of a survey done, I should shout out, is done with Inmarsat as well. So all need a sponsor for these kind of things. Interestingly, the question, will global legislation be able to keep pace with technical innovations? And it was 74% saying no. And that really is kind of where your little piece at the end there kind of makes a lot of sense, because the just-in-time thing, I remember that when I was, a young man in this industry, where it makes total sense, right, that you can get that just-in-time arrival, that slow steam suits, makes sense for everybody. And the fact that you see that as still potentially being a pinch point that needs, where the automation comes from, how you then deal with all the fallout from the party, rather than they're kind of like being the just-in-time bot, which is speaking to the charterer, which is doing, which is negotiating all these things. I think that was quite a sobering touch that you put in there.
It's been going on for decades. I think it was BP. They pioneered virtual arrival at the beginning of the 2000s, and it's not a technology question or a technology problem. It is purely a contractual problem and an incentives problem. And it sort of blows my mind a bit that we haven't been able to overcome that.
I think we could probably do a whole show on things where technology is not the problem, because like you just reminded me there of something. My uncle worked for Shell, and which is not in any way any reason that I became involved in the shipping industry. He's been retired for longer than I've been in the industry. But one of the things that came up in a discussion was one of the projects that he'd been working on, which would have been over 20 years ago now, which was like a digital bill of lading. And to my knowledge, we still don't have them. And it's like that we could add into that the Uberization of shipbroking. We could add in like this just-in-time. I think we should do a whole show just on the number of things that the technology is outstripping our ability to be able to do the intelligent thing for lots of other reasons, and some of those reasons are rather nice and human, and some of them are just kind of bureaucratic. But let's do a whole show on that
I like
very
that.
subject. And yeah, and if you're listening, we'd love to hear your examples and
Yeah.
ideas. That would be fantastic. So maybe we've got time for another thing, and we're talking about like I guess the technology and disruption, and we talked a lot about AI. But I also think, I talked last week about, follow the money, the final investment decision that chap had. I must start writing the names of these people down. So preparing for a podcast, I'm quoting people and say that fella that I met. But final investment decision, was really kind of like, because that's when where's the money moving. That's where you know what's happening. And that naturally leads us into A. And I think it was one of the stories that I just want to shout out this week was the press release from this new venture called Maris, which is a combination of someone we know very well, Manish Singh, and GTCR, who are a US-based private equity house. Now, that caught both our eyes. I think we kind of swapped a couple of WhatsApp messages, when it was announced and stuff like that. And, private equity in our sector is not novel. I think it's something that it's been going back for many, many years. But I think this is really significant. And I think it's something that we could perhaps return to, because as we see, what they get up to and stuff, because I think that having a very formal partnership between an investment house and a person that's been very involved in M&A, but deeply involved in the shipping industry. Of course, I know him very well. We set up Ocean Technologies Group together in 2020 when he was the CEO. So obviously, I haven't had a chance to discuss it with him yet. But I think it's a significant sort of steer as to how that investment house is seeing the need to kind of have this more strategic kind of overall vision for working with a leader in the space. And I think that one of the things that comes out quite strongly when you look at the press release itself and some of the conversation that's been happening around that, some of the sort of social posting, that kind of thing, I think there's sort of two things going on in the sector at the moment. I think one, there's people that are kind of buying up portfolios of businesses, so businesses that are doing well, that they see growth potential in, and sort of building up that portfolio, because obviously there's a natural synergy that can happen from getting businesses into one portfolio and having access to customer bases and stuff like that. But I think there's a different thing happening in some cases as well, where it's actually people who are buying things with a view to some sort of ecosystem existing, and where they're actually looking at picking up businesses that knit together. And so you might call it a consolidation with purpose, with the kind of user in mind, or with a sort of ICP in mind, that has a sort of strong rationale for combining businesses. And this is definitely what I see in this as what should we call it? This is not a partnership, effectively, isn't it? I think it was announced as a partnership, and that's kind of clearly the intent that's coming out of there already. And so I think that that's going to be really interesting to see where they kind of see different businesses being complementary and starting to build out that sort of ecosystem there. And I would expect that this also solves another fundamental point. I think it's going to be looking at it much more holistically as an industry and taking perhaps a more patient view of how you build that real sort of superpowered solution for the future. Because I think that if you've got the typical sort of private equity event horizon of 3 to 5 years, it's very, very difficult to do more than put the business on steroids and kind of jack it up and of, increase its market share or something like that. But you're not really able to look at maybe some of the kind of really intelligent plays that need to be made to put together the sort of ecosystems that we're seeing emerging from some of these funds.
I think there's obviously the interest from PE is super interesting, and what Manish is doing with GTC is quite exciting. I'm really interested to see where that goes. In fact, we should ask him if he'll come on and talk about it. I think it'd be really interesting to get his view. And if you're listening, Manish, then text one of us. We'll try and get something in the diary. But I think there's kind of two interesting approaches here. One is obviously the traditional PE model of buy, merge and flip, and I think we've seen quite a lot of that recently, and every time one of those transactions happens, we see a big uptick in PE interest in the sector. Generally, we get quite a lot of inquiries from funds, some of which just get put off by the complexity of the market when we kind of dive into it with them. And some actually see exactly as you were saying, what those really interesting kind of ecosystem plays are. But actually, I think underneath all of that, and probably operating a little bit more quietly, is there are a growing number of buy to hold firms operating. And, you've obviously got the big ones like Constellation Software that own I think now 3 or 4 different maritime software businesses, and they are a buy to hold, and will their aim is to never sell. But there's probably 3 or 4 more that have come onto the scene that we're aware of over the last few years. And so they're doing some really interesting stuff, and their whole approach is that they want to buy these businesses, buy a platform, buy the kind of strategic acquisitions to either grow the customer base or to grow the product suite, but they want to hold for the long term. And I think that creates, that patient capital is something that is often lacking in maritime. And we've really seen that start to tick up on the VC side. Notice you've got Motion Ventures listed in your notes. And I think that over the last 5 years, that's started to tell a really good story. I think something that we're just at the beginnings of seeing is these kind of buy to hold firms coming in.
They're patient.
That are going to be patient, go through the integration in a really thorough way and create something really exciting for the long term.
Well, yeah, I think this is really at the heart. This speaks to the heart of transformation as well. There are, of course, things that can kind of pop up and be game changing very, very quickly. But when you look at where we are as an industry, you look at the uncertainty that's going on, I think you need to have a patient approach, and you need to have a hedged approach, by the way, as well, because as we were talking last week, you've got this very volatile picture. I described it as a pendulum swinging kind of anything to do with decarb around where that's going. And I think that, a lot of that is also true. There are some things that could really fundamentally change the game at any point. And so having a kind of a portfolio and a bit of a hedged kind of approach and a kind of in the things you're backing is quite important. Because I thought this might lead to a more general discussion about it, I also kind of put some feelers out and to sort of people that I know are working in the space, and it's some quite interesting things. The pattern of consolidation that was expected in 2025 is bang on, is exactly what they were expecting, and the feeling of the secret squirrel that I was talking to, who's your, I'm not naming names. Half the time I can't remember people's names, but but in this case, the names changed to protect the innocent. He was saying that, but firstly, a couple of points, which are nothing kind of secretive really, but the feeling that there were too many technology businesses to support the market, really fundamentally. So they have to kind of consolidate. He was suggesting to survive that there's just simply need to be something that happens. Felt that a lot of the businesses that were out there are overvalued, and I would certainly say that my experience, as you can imagine, I've been involved in a bit of M&A over the last 5 years, and looking at really exciting businesses. Great idea, maybe something really interesting emerging, but very little substance behind when it comes to actually what does the order book look like, what's the customer base, and so on. And so that makes sense to me what you said there. One of the things that was really interesting to me, though, was this idea that actually maritime is bucking the trend that we're seeing in M&A more generally. So there's been a bit of a cooling in more generally in business acquisitions. That is not being seen in maritime. So I think, again, it's significant that we've got a big investment house that's been looking at this, has been working through and coming up with a very strategic approach for how they can come in and make a difference in this space. So I think that's really going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think on that point of valuations and multiples, I think a mistake that a lot of founders make, not necessarily in this sector, but just generally, is massively overvaluing their baby. And the reality is we track M&A multiples at Thetius, and we actually have a report coming out in the next couple of weeks that goes into it. So I will make a note to come back to this in a few weeks. But the multiples are not as high as one might expect, or certainly not as high as many entrepreneurs expect, and actually lower than a lot of other sectors, because this is seen as a slightly unsexy space. And I think wrongly in my view. Obviously we're biased, but we think it's sexy. I think the general cooling we've seen from across the PE sector has all been down to interest rates, obviously going up quite significantly in the last few years, and the cost of debt generally. And that's where I think actually these lower valued, less sexy sectors that are trading at lower multiples suddenly start to become interesting. And I think that's probably why you've correctly observed that it's not really slowed down in maritime in the same way it has in other sectors.
Yeah, could well be. But also as well, I think there's been some big deals, not least the one I was involved in, and that again gets people's attention. I've met people sort of in wider industry who have said, "Oh yeah, I heard about that deal," and so that's kind of this becomes, I think, something that of course people come in and you hope you're going to find a gold, so, a nugget of gold or whatever, something, an unpolished diamond that you can kind of do. So I'm not surprised at all to see that. But what I was just going to say, I mean, on this was obviously with that report you've got coming out, we are seeing I'm getting a lot of inbound from people in the investment community who are about the podcast actually, and saying, this is great. This feels like I'm on getting the kind of the real story kind of thing. So I think we should lean into that, and let's do maybe a couple of shows time. We'll have devote it to looking at some of these M&A plays and maybe speculating about what some of them have got in mind and where they're going to go. And that could be a really interesting one. So yeah, if you hate that idea, let us know. Otherwise we'll just carry on. I mean, we might carry on anyway.
And if you love it, you have to keep listening until we do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So please do like and subscribe, because it's wonderful for our egos. Get very excited about it.
Yeah, there's an analytics panel on Spotify, so I now have new analytics to obsess over.
Oh,
and Ron and I both have very fragile egos, so if you don't subscribe, we'll be very upset.
Yeah. And keep the suggestions coming. It's going to be, things slow down over the summer, so we need to know. We need your tips and what you want us to focus on and talk about.
Awesome. Thanks, Well. That was good fun.
Yeah, good fun. See you next time.
See you next week. Cheers.